army doesn't like more than one disaster in a day.
Looks bad in the newspapers and upset civilians at their breakfast.
I'm Bill Bupert, retired Army officer and irregular warfare practitioner and scholar. Welcome to Chasing Ghosts, an irregular warfare podcast, the show that examines the mythos, lost history, bad thinking, martial malpractice, and government incompetence that informs so much of irregular warfare. Today I want to peek behind the curtain at the vast machinery and briar patch politics of insurgency and counterinsurgency and everything in between. Now, let's go ghost hunting together. Hello and welcome to episode 083 of the Chasing Ghosts podcast, an irregular warfare podcast. A companion podcast called War Notes, a Conflict podcast, is one that I publish occasionally. The title of today's is Memorial Day Remembrance 2026, and I would like to issue an advisory warning today, and that's don't listen to this podcast episode if you happen to be imbued with a super patriotism in which you are incredibly effused with joy at this day and joy at what the U.S. and its armed forces do around the world. This is not the show for you, so I would turn around if I were you and go to some happy, joy talk that there may be on other podcasts or television shows or anything like that that paints a brighter picture, a happier picture. What I would suggest is a false picture of what this day represents. A little bit of housekeeping. Yea, and verily, my libraries are up and I am happy. Unpacking hundreds of boxes of books always brings me great joy. Packing those books does just the opposite. I have two rooms. One is my office, one is my podcast studio. Both are festooned with bookshelves on which a lifetime's collection of books, minus those that I've either donated, gifted, got rid of, or found another home for them, as I am for an entire tubby full of preparedness books that I'm going to be gifting to one of my best friends in Louisiana. He and I served together overseas. We've served here. We've been through some adventures together, and of my small coterie of friends, I award him the badge of honor of being the most dedicated, realistic prepper guy that I know, because I find that as my years enter the winter phase of this life until I shuffle off of this mortal coil, my interest in prepping is starting to reach a point at which it concerns me in the short term. But the efforts that I have done in the past to ensure that I was ready for whatever calamity may befall us, whether man-made or nature, it doesn't animate me as much as it does. And of course, with retirement impending, it means that you spend a lot more money on stuff that you may not necessarily need. I even find that my lifelong acquaintance and continuing mastery of small arms is reaching its conclusions too, because, and I am not happy to admit this, but I think at this point where we are entering the last 3 quarters, have entered the last 3 quarters of the 21st century, small arms, infantry, small unit tactics, all of those kind of things have probably been on their way to the historical dustbin at the small unit infantry level, to the point where I suspect in this next quarter century, by 2050, drones and robotic warriors and robotic warfare are going to supersede all human manifestations on the battlefield, as it were. A shout out to all my paid subscribers on my Substack. Thank you so much for supporting my efforts and putting money in the tip jar and giving me the opportunity at the margin to buy more books. So thank you for that. My wife and I were unpacking everything and putting it away, and she puts it away in a far more aesthetically pleasing fashion than I do. But I found that I would have conversations with her about the interaction that I'd have with various books that I grabbed out of the box and went to put them on the shelf and such. And lifelong friends. I've been reading vociferously since I've been 6 years old, and it continues now, probably until I assume room temperature or can no longer read. If you have not become a paid subscriber, please do so if you get the opportunity. If you wish to get in touch with me, it is cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. An even easier way is to become a free subscriber, if not a paid subscriber, on my Substack. On the show notes, you will see how to get to that very site and leave comments. By the way, speaking of leaving stuff, leaving cybernetic trails, if you happen to listen to this podcast on the podcast vendor of your choice, I would be so obliged if you would leave a 4 or 5 star rating on it. But if you leave a narrative comment under said rating, I will be forever in your debt. And thank you so much for that. So, on with the episode. For those who are consistent listeners, you will know this already, but I retired from the Army as an officer. And then after that, I continued going overseas to various neo-imperialist shit pits, to include a 2-year stint in Afghanistan in 13 and 15 of this century. And I know of what I speak. I've seen things that I wish I could unsee, and I suffer the kind of moral injury that I have described ad infinitum, peppered throughout all the episodes that I've done, and I think I've even devoted to moral injury for those listeners who are new, is that weight, that load you carry after being in a conflict that is filled with the regret and soul-searching of maybe not having done the right thing. I wanted to quote J.R.R. Tolkien, one of my favorite authors, from The Two Towers. He says, quote, "War must be while we defend our lives against a destroyer who would devour all, but I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I love only that which they defend." End of quote. And I've always found that an inspiration for my early conclusion that the only just war, and in no way am I endorsing the Catholic just war theory, the only just war in my mind is the war to defend your own soil on your soil, and not the exportation of war and violence around the planet, especially in the expeditionary fashion that America has been doing, especially since its capture of the Hawaiian Islands in 1893. And then America was just pressing the accelerator on its colonial ambition then in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, in which it would find itself having suzerainty over not only the Caribbean, but pretty much over the next 3 decades over the entirety of Latin America. And this, of course, would include the far-flung reaches of the Philippines, which had also been part of this war that was conducted from 1898 to 1902. 2 declared wars would occur in the Philippines, and the U.S. occupation or colonization, or however you want to characterize the American suzerainty over the Philippines starting in 1898, would not end until a temporary interregnum on December 8th, 1941, when the U.S. would be thrown off of its domination of the Philippines until late 1944 and early 1945 with the battles of the Luzon, which was a rather savage affair. Maybe one can say, and you will discover why I'm saying this, even more savage than what the Americans did in the Philippines at the turn of the century. As detailed in James M. Scott's brilliant book, Rampage, MacArthur, Yamashita, and the Battle of Manila, in which I think that nearly, and of course it's really hard to plumb these numbers and have a precision or accuracy as to just how solid these numbers are, but on the order of 1 million plus civilians were murdered, raped, and just mutilated by the Japanese in late 44 and early 45 in a scorched earth policy that absolutely decimated large urban sections of the Philippines at the time. But I'd like to step back in time. I'd like to go to the Philippines in the first parts of the 20th century, and of course the very last years of the 19th century. Now, before we do that, a slight preamble. Since 1775, there have been approximately 1.4 million deaths and total U.S. casualties of approximately 2.8 million in various wars that the United States has fought in. This death could fill a lake with about 1.7 million gallons of blood, which could fill a city's swimming pool that was 30 feet deep and 275 feet at each side. The deaths on the other side in the belligerent camp appear to be exponentially larger by any standard when one examines the history. In essence, not only are we asked to memorialize these conflicts that always manage to strengthen the government's power on the other side, if not ours, we are exposed to a constant drumbeat of protecting our freedom, yet no existential threat to the USA has existed since the cessation of hostilities with the United Kingdom in 1814. For those of you not in the know, on August 24th of 1814, the British burned down the White House. So this celebration of Memorial Day should not be about the soldiery. It should be a mass wake and reflection on the untold millions of innocents detained, kidnapped, injured, napalmed, firebombed, incinerated, shot, mutilated, tortured, and murdered by the naked grasping of the American central government for ever-increasing power and control at home and abroad in what I would characterize, for the most part, as wars of choice. Now, because of the brevity and nature of these podcast episodes, I can't spend the 9 to 10 hours that I spent when I did Trail of Tears, the history of American stalemate and defeat since 1945, that you will find as a course offering at the Scott Horton Institute. I'll leave a place in the show notes where, if you're interested, maybe you can find that. These acres of tombstones are also a fitting symbol to the state of liberty over time in America, as a result of these folks marching to the drumbeat of expanding America forever. A friend of mine characterized war as nothing more than a dispute between plantation owners who quizzically and cleverly get the helots to spill their blood to build heavier chains and more effective manacle systems in those respective systems, because what you discover after every conflict, America in particular, but I'm certain you can go to any country on earth and find the same thing, liberty and freedom are more diminished. For those who think that Americans in particular have a moral fiber and strength that prevents them from committing atrocities, hasn't been paying attention to history. And I'm not simply accusing the Americans of doing this very thing, because there have been so many moral calamities that have been committed by countries that go to war, but I'll describe some that you may not be familiar with. So I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time on My Lai, because in episode 46, Review and Discussion, My Lai, Vietnam, 1968, and the Descent into Darkness by Howard Jones, which I reviewed for that episode and went into, and again, it's a gut-wrenching episode. It will corrode your soul, much like Martyr made Daryl Cooper's episode, The Anti-Humans, which, again, a warning, please don't listen to these things unless you can bear the scars of what it will do to you after you've listened to it. In this case, what happened at My Lai was so wrong in so many ways. There were villains and there were heroes. One of those heroes in My Lai, which was the massacre that occurred in 1968 at a Vietnamese village, which, by the way, when the 15-6, the military investigation was done, it was done by one Lieutenant Colonel Colin Powell. Yep, I'm certain you know who that is. So I'm telling you this short little story about Hugh Clowers Thompson, who was a serving helicopter pilot, a warrant officer in the 123rd Aviation Battalion of the 23rd Infantry Division at the time, to show you that, yes, America has done awful things, but also, yes, America has people with the moral fiber and the spine to do the right thing in the face of the worst human calamities. On March 16, 1968, Thompson and his Hiller OH-23 Raven observation helicopter crew, one Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andreatta, were ordered to support Task Force Barker's search and destroy missions in Soon Mai, what we know as My Lai. Army intelligence had said that they were concerned that there were Viet Cong in Soon Mai. This was inaccurate, but nonetheless, Lieutenant Calley and his platoon had been conducting war crimes all morning at this village. I'm not going to go into the gory details, as it were, here. If you're interested, episode 46, and again, please purchase Howard Jones' book if you're courageous enough to do so, because I highly recommend it if you want to get the inside track on what happened on that fateful day in 1968. Now, Thompson and his crew, who at first thought the artillery bombardment had caused all the civilian deaths on the ground that they were seeing there, became aware that Americans were murdering the villagers after a wounded civilian woman they requested medical evacuation for, No Tito, was murdered right in front of them by Captain Medina, the commanding officer of the operation. According to Lawrence Coburn, one of those crewmen, quote, "Then we saw a young girl about 20 years old lying on the grass. We could see that she was unarmed and wounded in the chest. We marked her with smoke because we saw a squad not too far away. The smoke was green, meaning it's safe to approach. Red would have meant the opposite. We were hovering 6 feet off the ground, not more than 20 feet away, when Captain Medina came over, kicked her, stepped back, and finished her off. He did it right in front of us. When we saw Medina do that, and by the way, Lieutenant Calley works for Medina, it clicked. It was our guys doing the killing," end of quote. Immediately after that execution, Thompson discovered the irrigation ditch full of Calley's victims. Thompson then radioed a message to accompanying gunships and Task Force Barker headquarters. "It looks to me like there's an awful lot of unnecessary killing going on down there. Something ain't right about this. There's bodies everywhere. There's a ditch full of bodies that we saw. There's something wrong here," end of quote. Lieutenant Calley then approaches Thompson, and the two exchanged an uneasy conversation. I am going to quote that conversation. "Thompson, what's going on here, LT? This is my business." "What is this? Who are these people?" "Just following orders." "Orders? Whose orders?" "Just following. But these are human beings, unarmed civilians, sir." Calley then looked at Thompson. "This is my show. I'm in charge here. It ain't your concern." Thompson, "Great job." Calley, "You better get back in the chopper and mind your own business." Thompson, "You ain't heard the last of this." And as Thompson was having this conversation with Calley, Sergeant David Mitchell fired into the irrigation ditch, killing any civilians still moving. Now, here's the unfortunate part of all of this. Far more killing occurred in Vietnam during the American war there from 62 to 75 than is let on. The only reason we know about My Lai is because of the courage of people like Thompson. Otherwise, this would be a footnote, an unknown footnote to Americans to know what they were funding with these soldiers who happened to be over there. According to Trent Angers in The Forgotten Hero of My Lai, the Hugh Thompson story, published in 2014, Quote, the helicopter looped around and set down quickly near the edge of the ditch. Andreatta had maintained visual contact with the spot. He saw the movement, and he darted out of the aircraft as soon as it touched the ground. Thompson got out and guarded one side of the chopper, and Coburn guarded the other. Andreatta had to walk on several badly mangled bodies to get where he was going. He lifted a corpse with several bullet holes in the torso, and there, lying under it, was a child, age 5 or 6, covered in blood and obviously in a state of shock. End of quote. Now, mind you, I am not calling Americans out for war crimes and saying that singularly throughout the millennia of human warfare and all the warfare that's taken place in the 20th century and 21st century by all antagonist combatants, that only the United States is the bad guy. That's not the case because these bad guys are found everywhere. Exhibit A would be Japanese conduct of their war from 1932 to 1945. 1932 to 1939 would be their preamble that they were conducting in China, where literally millions of people were slaughtered, many of them civilians, by the Japanese as a matter of policy. Now, would it only be the Japanese that would do this as a matter of policy? It would not. Mind you, watch your step into the time machine, and we are going to hurry back to 1898 to 1902 with the Americans in the Philippines. There's a document that I discovered, World Future Fund, U.S. War Crimes in the Philippines, and I used this to do some of the research for this episode. Let me read some excerpts. The United States finds itself in the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War. Some of the language I'm going to employ you may find jarring, but I'm going to read it verbatim from the documents that were provided and that they found. Quote, like many of their officers, American troops also showed incredible callousness towards the Philippine civilian population. A man named Clarence Clow described the situation as follows in a letter he wrote to Senator Hoar. The methods employed by American troops against civilians in an effort to find insurgent arms and ammunition include torture, beating, and outright killing. At any time, I am liable to be called upon to go out and bind and gag helpless prisoners, to strike them in the face, to knock them down when so bound, to bear them away from wife and children at their very door who are shrieking pitifully the while, or kneeling and kissing the hands of our officers, imploring mercy from those who seem not to know what it is, and then with a crowd of soldiers hold our helpless victim head downward in a tub of water in his own yard, or bind him hand and foot, attaching ropes to head and feet, and then lowering him into the depths of a well of water till life is well nigh choked out, and the bitterness of death is tasted, and our poor grasping victims ask us for the poor boon of being finished off in mercy of themselves. End of quote. Yes, you did hear it here. When it comes to waterboarding, which the Americans, thanks to the Bush administration and the awful office, revived as a form of torture, thanks to the keen lawyers in the OLA who cooked up what they could for Bolshevik II to do these very things, that waterboarding originated in the American forces at the end of the 19th century. Now, I don't know if these were used against Aboriginal Americans by the Army. I haven't been able to dig that up. But all these things have been done at one time or another by American soldiers, generally in cases of trying to obtain information as to the location of arms and ammunition. If you'll recall, for those history students in my audience, it was the seizure of arms, ammunition, cannon, and such that lit the match, as it were, that was the shot heard round the world, April 19th, 1775, that set forth our divorce proceedings in the United States against the British. Back to the Philippines, nor can it be said that there is any repulsion on the part of the enlisted men in taking part in these doings. I regret to have to say that. On the contrary, the majority of soldiers take a keen delight in them and rush with joy to the making of this latest development of a Roman holiday. Another soldier, L.F. Adams, with the Washington Regiment, described what he saw after the Battle of Manila on February 4th and 5th, 1899. Quote, "In the path of the Washington Regiment and Battery Delta of the 6th Artillery, there were 1,008 dead niggers," and this comes from the document itself, "and a great many wounded. We burned all their houses. I don't know how many men, women, and children the Tennessee boys did kill. They would not take any prisoners." You will note that the use of that word applies to any brown people that they happen to have run across on Earth. Similarly, Sergeant Howard McFarland of the 43rd Infantry wrote in the Fairfield Journal of Maine, quote, "I am now stationed in a small town in charge of 25 men, and we have a territory of 20 miles to patrol. At the best, this is a very rich country, and we want it. My way of getting it would be to put a regiment into a skirmish line and blow every," and I'm not going to read the rest of it, but it's blowing the inhabitants, using a very offensive word, into kingdom come. On Thursday, March 29th, 18 of my company killed 75 of these bolo men and 10 of the gunners. When we find one that is not dead, we have bayonets, end of quote. Now, look, these methods were condoned by some back at home in the U.S. as exemplified by this statement of a Republican congressman in 1909. Quote, "You never hear of any disturbances in northern Luzon, and the secret of its pacification is, in my opinion, the secret of pacification of the archipelago. They never rebel in northern Luzon because there isn't anybody there to rebel. The country was marched over and cleaned in a most resolute manner. The good Lord in heaven only knows the number of Filipinos that were put underground. Our soldiers took no prisoners. They kept no records. They simply swept the country, and wherever or whenever they could get a hold of a Filipino, they killed him. The women and children were spared and may be now noticed in disproportionate numbers on that part of the island," end of quote. Countless incidents, small and large, in between, from the only nation state in the Western world that not only endorses the use of torture, but makes it an official means of projecting power abroad. That was then, this is now. You know, the only just war, as I mentioned, is one fought to defend one's own soil from invasion. There is no other in my mind, especially as an amateur historian who has looked at millennia of warfare. Every other conflict reeks of statist opportunism and this yen to expand these tax jurisdictions and the power to rob others of their wealth and resources through military domination. Some may mistake this for a pretense of the left. Not only do the progressives and the collectivists in America have a rich history of cheerleading wars, such as World War I and World War II, but they also wish to employ military-style violence domestically to achieve their government supremacist dreams. I would point you in the direction of the 1932 Bonus March, where no less than the likes of Patton, Eisenhower, and MacArthur would use the side of their sheathed swords to beat the starch out of World War I veterans who had gathered in D.C. to see what they could do about the promise made for their bonuses from that war that hadn't been paid yet. And remember, this was on the eve of the Great Depression. The notion that foreign wars and entanglements are wrong still emanates from a sparsely populated philosophical quarter that has no majority presence in the academy of the government. It's a true voice in the wilderness. A voice has one signature message. You cannot thank a veteran for your freedom because they have actively done nothing more than endanger its very existence, and that's coming from a veteran himself. In fact, American military power abroad and increasingly at home has made civilians more unsafe than they have ever been. The threat not only emerges from aggrieved victims of American brutality abroad, but a government desperate in bad times to ensure that not $1 of military expenditures is reduced. America is now a national security garrison state. Think about that the next time you take a flight. As a matter of fact, I think that it is this very administration that we are under as we speak that wishes to expand the budget of the DOW, Department of War, not Defense, how appropriate, from nearing $1 trillion with $900 billion to $1.5 billion. What a huge error that would be. Look, veterans don't need gratitude. They need a self-realization on their part that the machine they work for was never an engine for liberty, but a device whose single purpose was aggrandizement of American political power at home and abroad. And that political hammer always extinguishes liberty and never expands it. Just to show you that this came from the highest quarters between August 1898 and February 1899, President McKinley finally disabused President Aguinaldo of his hopes on December 21st, 1898, when he issued the so-called Benevolent Assimilation Proclamation after sending the Spanish packing from their colony. He says, quote, "The destruction of the Spanish fleet in the harbor of Manila by the U.S. squadron commanded by Rear Admiral Dewey, followed by the reduction of the city and the surrender of the Spanish forces, practically effected the conquest of the Philippine Islands and the suspension of Spanish sovereignty therein, with the signature of the Treaty of Peace between the U.S. and Spain by their respective plenipotentiaries in Paris on the 10th instant." That would be December. "And as a result of the victories of American arms, the future control, disposition, and government of the Philippine Islands are ceded to the United States. In the fulfillment of the rights of sovereignty thus acquired and the responsible obligations thus assumed, the actual occupation and administration of the entire group of the Philippine Islands become immediately necessary in the military government heretofore maintained by the United States in the city, harbor, and bay of Manila to be extended with all possible dispatch to the whole ceded territory," unquote. The Philippines would thus not receive the independence that they had fought so hard to achieve. Instead, it was made apparent to Aguinaldo and his followers that they had simply assisted the transition of the rule of the Philippines from one foreign power to another. I want to draw your attention to a few items here. General J.M. Bell wrote in December 1901, and I'm giving this to you as an example of what's going on here, says, quote, "I am now assembling in the neighborhood of 2,500 men who will be used in columns of about 50 men each. I take so large a command for the purpose of thoroughly searching each ravine, valley, and mountain peak for insurgents and for food, expecting to destroy everything I find outside of towns. All able-bodied men will be killed or captured. These men need a thrashing to teach them good common sense, and they should have it for the good of all concerned." End of quote. This same General Bell, in Batangas, December 9th, 1901, sends Circular Order Number 3 to all American commanders in the field. Quote, "A general conviction, which the brigade commander shares, appears to exist that the insurrection in this brigade continues because a greater part of the people, especially the wealthy ones, pretend to desire but in reality do not want peace. That when all really want peace, we can have it promptly. Under such circumstances, it is clearly indicated that a policy should be adopted that will, as soon as possible, make the people want peace and want it badly. Commanding officers are urged and enjoined to use their discretion freely in adopting any and all measures of warfare authorized by this order, which will contribute in their judgment toward enforcing the policy or accomplishing the purpose above mentioned." He goes on, quote, "The same course should be pursued with all of this class. For arrest anyone believed to be guilty of giving aid or assistance to the insurrection in any way, or of giving food or comfort to the enemies of the government, it is not necessary to wait for sufficient evidence to lead to conviction by a court, but those strongly suspected of complicity with the insurrection may be arrested and confined as a military necessity, and may be held indefinitely as POWs in the discretion of the station commander and until the receipt of other orders from higher authority." Now, mind you, the Secretary of War at the time, Elihu Root, endorsed what General Bell was doing. In an amazing letter to the Senate, dated May 7th, 1902, Root argued that, quote, the War Department saw no reason to doubt that the policy embodied in the above-mentioned orders were at once the most effective and most humane which could possibly be followed. And so indeed it has proved. Guerrilla warfare in Batangas and Laguna and the adjacent regions have been ended, and the authority of the United States has been asserted and acquiesced in, and the people who have been collected and protected in the camps of concentration have been permitted to return to their homes and remove their customary pursuits in peace. The War Department has not disapproved or interfered in any way with the orders giving effect to this policy, but has aided in their enforcement by directing an increase of food supply to the Philippines for the purpose of caring for the natives in the concentration camps. End of quote. Now, mind you, this use of the phraseology concentration camps, I had thought before I read all of this data about what happened in the Philippines wars with the United States, that in southwestern Africa, it was the Germans and their colonial holdings who started concentration camps. As a matter of fact, I thought it may have been even earlier during the First and Second Boer Wars when the English fought against the South Africans who were seeking to remove themselves from the British Empire, as it were, that they had created concentration camps. But it appears that between 1890 and 1905, and I am certain that there are historians who have dug into this, it seems that either through collusion or simply cylinders of excellence, it was the Germans, the United States, and the British who found a way to use concentration camps as a means by which to wrest the agency of the population from themselves and dominate and control them behind barbed wire. And I call to your attention what happened on the early morning of September 20th, 1901, where the residents of the small village of Balangiga, located in the Samar province, attacked the men of U.S. Company Charlie, 9th U.S. Infantry, who were stationed in the area. While the Americans ate breakfast, church bells in the town began to peal. This was the signal for hundreds of Filipinos armed with machetes and bolos to attack the garrison. 48 U.S. soldiers, two-thirds of the garrison, were butchered in what was called the Balangiga Massacre of the Filipinos, who attacked. As many as 150 were killed. American troops began retaliating. And during an interview with General Jacob H. Smith, who assigned a Major Littleton Waller to punish these inhabitants of Samar, he says, quote, I want no prisoners. I wish you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the better you will please me. And further, that he wanted all persons killed who were capable of bearing arms in an actual hostilities against the U.S. and did, in reply to a question by Major Waller asking for an age limit, designate the limit as 10 years of age. I repeat again, 10 years of age. General Smith did give instructions to Major Waller to kill and burn and make Samar a howling wilderness. And he admits that he wanted everybody killed, capable of bearing arms, and that he did specify all over 10 years of age, as the Samar boys of that age were equally as dangerous as their elders. End of quote. Now, the death toll of this American occupation of the Philippines. Over 1.5 million died out of a total population of 6 million. I think that this rivals the genocide plus qualities of what the Australians did in Tasmania in the 19th century. A detailed estimate of both civilian and American military dead is offered by historian John Gates, who sums up the subject as follows, quote, of some 125,000 Americans who fought in the islands. At one time or another, almost 4,000 died here. Of the non-Muslim Filipino population, which numbered approximately 6.7 million, at least 34,000 lost their lives as a direct result of the war, and as many as 200,000 may have died as a result of the cholera epidemic at war's end. The U.S. Army's death rate in the Philippine-American War was the equivalent of the nation having lost over 86,000 of roughly 2.7 million engaged during the Vietnam War instead of the approximately 58,000 who were lost in the conflict. For the Filipinos, the loss of 34,000 lives was the equivalent to the U.S. losing over 1 million people from a population of 250 million. And if the cholera deaths are also attributed to the war, the equivalent death toll for the United States would be 8 million. The war, which one hears so little about, was not a minor skirmish. End of quote. Another estimate says that Philippine military deaths are estimated at 20,000, with 16,000 actually counted, while civilian deaths number between 250 and 1 million Filipinos. These numbers take into account those killed by war, malnutrition, and a cholera epidemic that raged during the war. Now I'm going to share with you something that's incredibly disturbing. It's incredibly disturbing to this amateur military historian who has read a lot when it comes to human warfare planet-wide throughout the millennia. The U.S. troops slaughtered Filipino civilians out of proportion to the conventions of so-called formal warfare were remarked upon during the Senate investigation of the war's conduct. As one official from the War Department estimated, quote, the comparative figures of killed and wounded, nearly 5 killed to 1 wounded if we take only the official returns, are absolutely convincing. When we examine them in detail and find the returns quoted of many killed and often no wounded, only one conclusion is possible. In no war where the usages of civilized warfare have been respected, has the number of killed approached the number of wounded more nearly than these figures. The rule is generally about 5 wounded to 1 killed. What shall we say about a war where the proportions are reversed? End of quote. That's incredibly disturbing. Fortunately, we know all of this because there was a U.S. Senate investigating committee on the Philippines, which was convened from January 31st, 1902 until its conclusion, and it was chaired by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge. The committee heard testimony concerning crimes that had been committed by U.S. troops and officers in the Philippines. And I will close this out with this one quote from Major Cornelius Gardner, a West Point grad of the U.S. Army's provincial governor of the Tayabas province in the Philippines, submitted the following evidence via letter on April 10, 1902. Quote, of late, by reason of the conduct of the troops, such as the extensive burning of the barrios and trying to lay waste to the country so that insurgents cannot occupy, the torturing of natives by so-called water cure, that would be waterboarding, and other methods in order to obtain information, the harsh treatment of natives generally, and the failure of inexperienced, lately appointed lieutenants commanding posts to distinguish between those who are friendly and those unfriendly, and to treat every native as if he were, whether or no, an insurrection at heart. This favorable sentiment above referred to is being fast destroyed in a deep hatred towards the United States engendered. End of quote. It's all so bloody disturbing. And if the Filipinos, and this would start to tone down by the 19-teens, if they thought they had it bad under the Americans, wait until the Japanese arrived December 8th, 1941, until they were kicked out of the country in February 1945. They would experience things that the Japanese did on a regular basis that would even make some of the awful things perpetrated by the United States at the turn of the 20th century pale in comparison. Now, mind you, fast forwarding to that war, we were in a death struggle in the Pacific Theater of Operations between the Americans, the Australians, the Dutch, the British, but more so the Americans, sharing the lion's share of that conflict. Everyone there knew that, for the most part, if one were to take an island, whether it was Peleliu, which was entirely unnecessary in my opinion, and one of the few times where I can charge Nimitz with neglect and even incompetence, because I certainly still think Admiral Nimitz was one of the finest admirals that this country, if not any country, has ever produced in the last 500 years. But you look at Tarawa, you look at Iwo Jima, you look at all those places, the number from the tens of thousands of Japanese killed, of those who were POWs or wounded or surrendered, would usually number in the dozens, if not the low hundreds. So what was done in the Philippines at the turn of the century can't be called an American marker of warfare. There are plenty of others, but we have these expectations with the narrative that's been driven into American skulls that we never conduct ourselves in such a savage fashion. But if one were to use the Pacific Theater of Operations, for instance, and the combatants, both U.S. and Japanese, wrestling with one another, there was no quarter given by anyone in the war. Now, what I particularly highlighted here is not only what happened to the combatants, but also what happened to the civilians. Now, you heard me mention that curious term water cure, which is actually waterboarding. It was done by throwing a person on, this is a quote from one of the documents at that congressional hearing. This was done by throwing him on his back beneath a tank of water and running a stream into his mouth, a man kneading his stomach meanwhile to prevent his drowning. The ordeal proved a tongue loosener, and the crafty old fellow soon begged for mercy and made full confession. The Presidente was asked for more information and had to take a second dose of water cure before he would divulge, end of quote. If you get the opportunity, August 9th, 1902, under the title Secretary Root's Record Marked Severities in Philippine Warfare, an analysis of the law and facts bearing on the action and utterances of President Roosevelt and Secretary Root, you will find something so bloody chilling when you look at that. Now, although 13 conclusions were drawn from the evidence, I wanted to highlight a few, and you can read the rest for yourself. Number one, that the destruction of Filipino life during the war had been so frightful that it cannot be explained as the result of ordinary civilized warfare. Number six, that the Secretary of War, Elihu Root, never made any attempt to check or punish this method of war. Number 12, that Mr. Root had shown a desire not to investigate, and on the other hand, to conceal the truth touching the war and to shield the guilty, and by censorship and otherwise has largely succeeded because, in the end of quote, Mr. Root is the real defendant in this case because the buck stops here. Now, the reason I have gone into such disturbing detail on what happened here is I want to provide everybody with an explanatory framework that no matter what movies one watches, what books you may read about American arms since, we could say, the end of the 18th century up until this point, has been of clean sterility, one of which we have always abided by the laws of warfare, the international laws of land warfare, that the Hague and Geneva Conventions that would be adopted in the 20th century were followed to the letter. Well, that's obviously not the case. I've shown you, I think, sufficient evidence from a brief little backwater conflict in the Pacific by the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And then if one were to look at the strategic bombing exploits of daylight bombing in World War II in both the Pacific Theater of Operations and the European Theater of Operations, and what I described to you happened at My Lai, and all the other war crimes incidents that have occurred since then in other wars the United States has conducted. I don't want anybody to sterilize or come away from these celebrations today instead of a wake on this Memorial Day to think that America is so pure of heart and innocent of the kind of savagery that we have seen in warfare, north and south, east and west, around the globe for millennia. that Memorial Day is not a day to celebrate. It's not a day to thank people. It's not a day to do any of that. It is a day to hang your head and assume that that moral injury, this existential moral injury, haunts us now, haunts us still, and paints the fabric of who we are. So read that as you wish. I urge you to go to the show notes, read some of the documentation that I have posted there, and see this day for what it is. There's nothing celebratory about this. This is a wake. So that concludes today's episode. This is Bill signing off soon. Please leave me a 4 or 5 star review if you please. And if you leave me a narrative review under those 4 or 5 stars at the podcast vendor of your choice, I am forever indebted. If you wish to get in touch with me, it is cgpodcast@pm.me. That is cgpodcast@pm.me. And also my Substack, where I post these episodes also not only going through RSS. And on Substack, you can comment. And I love gentlemanly back and forth comments. So please, indulge me. Come have a conversation. This is Bill, out.